Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What did the Irish Mission at the United Nations do to help develop the Sustainable Development Goals, to eliminate poverty, to promote quality education, and to really work on climate change and saving the environment? My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is His Excellency Ambassador David Donoghue. Ambassador Donoghue is Ireland's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Donoghue also co-authored a book, Negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, a Transformational Agenda for an Insecure World. And it's a very interesting book, and I'm going to hold it up here so our viewers can take a look at that. But Your Excellency, Ambassador Donoghue, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get right into this, into your book shortly. But let's talk just for a moment about the concept of Sustainable Development Goals. This is not a household term. It's very important. But these goals were really built on the Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2015. 8 laudable, quantifiable goals to reduce poverty by 50%, to really to stop or reverse the AIDS epidemic, to focus on gender equality, those types of things. But what is this Sustainable Development Goal concept?
Well, strictly speaking, Bill, the new goals that we now have, the Sustainable Development Goals, are the replacement for the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. Yes, they built on them, but those Millennium Development Goals, they covered the period from the year 2000 until 2015. So we were anyway going to have a new set of goals, but they took into account very much what had gone before. This time round, it was felt that we should have a much wider approach, which would bring together the economic, social and environmental dimensions. So if you like, the MDGs had been 8 goals focused exclusively on development issues, the development in the classic sense. This time round, the feeling was we need to try to marry those development goals, the objective of eradicating poverty, with the wider, with certain other issues, including fighting preserving the environment and fighting climate change, but also creating conditions for stable economic growth. So that's what I mean by the 3 dimensions: economic, social and environmental. So number one, the canvas this time was much broader. We were really we were aiming for a much wider range of topics. Number 2, this time around, they are goals which every country in the world has taken for itself. So 193 member states at the UN agreed to these goals, whereas the MDGs were not negotiated. They were simply created by people at the UN and announced. But this time around, it was felt that all member states should be able to have ownership of the goals. And so those are really crucial distinctions. A much wider range of topics covering poverty eradication, preserving the planet and creating conditions for stable economic growth. And at the same time then these, if you like, the countries for whom the goals are designed will be every country in the world, not just developing countries. And that's what we call a universal agenda. And that's one of the great challenges with the new agenda. And as I say, the fact that this new framework had to be agreed word for word by all 193 member states.
That word for word, you hit on 3 very key words there. This is so critical. If we think back to the 8 Millennium Development Goals, they were imposed basically top down. It was, I think, former Secretary General Kofi Annan was really the brainchild of the Millennium Development Goals. And then these were really sort of from the grassroots up, and you had a lot of participation. And these goals are very laudable: to eliminate poverty by 2030, to promote quality education, to eliminate hunger, to save the planet, basically. And there are 17 goals with 169 targets, or sub-goals, I guess we could say. During this whole process, did you they're all important, they're all interlinked, but did you prioritize them, or did you just say all 17 are equal?
It's a tricky question, because strictly speaking, the answer is that none of the goals is meant to be prioritized over any other. This is meant to be an interconnecting framework with connections really visible across all of the goals. So, for example, the achievement of a health goal will depend on the achievement of the education goal. Environmental progress will also have an impact on the achievement of the food and nutrition goal, etc. So they are all interconnected, and therefore it is invidious to decide that one goal is more important than another. Having said that, I think as a matter of realism, some goals will be less important for individual countries than others. So a country which is landlocked, I suspect, will not be giving priority to the oceans goal and so on. But that's not meant to be declared. If you like, we are all signing up to the same set of goals, not prioritizing one over another, but it would be for each country to decide how it wants to go about achieving them. There is no particular timetable laid down, if you like, other than the goal of achieving them all by 2030, and there will be regular monitoring arrangements at the international level. But if an individual country chooses to put more effort into education or energy at the outset, well, that's up to that country. Nobody else will be dictating what it should do. But ultimately, we have all accepted the same goals and the same targets, the sub-goals, if you like, under each of them, and we are not meant to be discriminating in favour of one or another.
When the Millennium Development Goals were being discussed, there were literally tens of thousands of organizations, Rotary International, Lions International, faith-based groups, probably 99%, that'd be a little high figure, but of the faith-based groups around the world supported these goals. They were working on them, but a lot of the folks who were members of these organizations were not aware of it for a variety of reasons. Is there some way to elevate the Sustainable Development Goals, get them maybe more highly publicized, so that people who are members of faith-based groups or social clubs or whatever it might be, social service clubs, could be involved and realize that they're working to achieve these very laudable goals?
Absolutely, Bill. And I should say that the negotiation process, which I had the honour to lead with the Ambassador of Kenya, that negotiation process was widened out to include civil society groups of all kinds, or to be precise, they were accompanying the negotiations. The actual negotiation was done by representatives of the member states, but we had a very, very large contingent of NGOs and academic and scientific groups, and obviously the NGOs would include faith-based groups. We had a very large community of different interest groups following us, and they were able to contribute in various ways to the process. So the final document, which was concluded on the 2nd of August in 2015, it bears the fingerprints, as it were, of many, many different groups around the world. And there also had been a very valuable UN exercise to raise awareness of the approaching new agenda even before it was completed. A thing called the My World survey in particular was very, very important. We now have a great challenge to bring these goals to the attention of the world's population, and in various ways that is being pursued. There are various media and films and information vehicles of one type or another are being used to try to elevate this awareness. Young people have a particular role to play through social media. They can actually spread word of the goals, but I won't go into too much detail, but let's just say that we are all very aware of the need this time round to get the good news, to get the message out to everybody as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned earlier, so many of these groups are on board, they're supporting these goals. Everybody wants a clean planet. They want a planet that's not where the ice caps are not melting. They want oceans that are clean. We see the Great Barrier Reef is starting to die now. A major tragedy is going on. Exactly. And of course we have to work on these problems, but it's in all of our best interest to go to UN.org or to Google Sustainable Development Goals or talk to our leaders in our service clubs or church groups or whatever it might be, schools, to talk about these goals and to get actively involved.
You mentioned schools, and there's a particular role to be played by teachers in educating the present young generation about the goals and what they mean for the future of young people today. I mean, clearly, if somebody is 8 or 9 years old now, these goals will accompany their adolescence, and we will be relying on today's young generation to actually ensure that the goals are delivered. So I hope that awareness of the goals can be increased through curricula, through actual teaching projects and various initiatives taken in schools around the world. There is an enormous amount to be done.
And there are many other issues to deal with. One issue that's been a major challenge for a variety of reasons, part of it because of climate change, part of it because of civil conflict in countries, has been that of refugees. And we see today the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and other groups are working with 65 million refugees. 10 years ago, it was 10 million. It's a crisis, a humanitarian crisis. Ireland is a member of the European Union. You're an active member of the United Nations. How has Ireland, or how has your mission gotten involved in perhaps working on the refugee problem in Europe? I know you're a little bit removed from where folks are coming across from Northern Africa and the Middle East, but you're still part of the European Union. I'm sure that migrants come to your area. But what are you working on now, and what's being done at the UN to focus on this real tragedy?
Absolutely, Bill. Well, just as I was appointed a co-facilitator of the negotiations which produced the 2030 agenda, I was later on appointed again as a co-facilitator of negotiations which led to the so-called New York Declaration. That came from a summit on the 19th of September last year at the UN, which looked at large-scale movements of refugees and migrants simultaneously. So this is the first time ever that the challenge of refugees and migrants, that these various issues and challenges were considered jointly. And we produced quite a detailed document which has dozens of commitments entered into by world leaders, because this document was adopted by world leaders at the summit. And I had a heavy involvement in the negotiation of that document, along with the ambassador of Jordan, who was my fellow co-facilitator. So Ireland, you're quite right, we haven't felt the brunt of the migration flows in Europe, partly because of our geographical position, but we are a country which has had a long history of immigration into the United States, into Australia and Britain. So, if you like, it is in our DNA. We know all about the experiences of immigrants. We are ourselves open to immigrants, and we were glad to have this opportunity to play a role at the UN in helping to broker a global solution or set of solutions for the challenges around refugees and the challenges around migration. So that is what we did over the last year or so.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps a university that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like our shows and you want to share them with your family, friends, neighbors, people in the community, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service. Today we're taking a look at the role of Ireland, the mission of Ireland at the United Nations, and focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals, refugees, and many other important issues. And my guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is His Excellency David Donoghue, who's the ambassador or permanent representative of the Irish mission to the United Nations, and he's also a co-author of this very interesting book called Negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, a Transformational Agenda for an Insecure World. Your Excellency, this is an insecure world, no doubt about that, and we're all on this planet together on this blue marble. And of course, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and how important they will be for the next 14 years, really, to try to help create a better world. I mean, that's the bottom line of what we're trying to do. And we were talking about the refugee situation, but there are also many others issues that you're dealing with at the United Nations and back home in Ireland, as all governments are and all peoples are. One area is in human rights. This is a very, sometimes a murky area at times, but the UN has the Human Rights Council that was created, I think, in 2005 to replace the old Human Rights Commission, as I recall. What role have you played or Ireland played on the Human Rights Council or being involved in this human rights issue?
Well, as it happens, Bill, Ireland was a member of the Human Rights Council for a 3-year period, which concluded just over a year ago. And I'd like to think that we made a contribution there through a number of initiatives which we were pushing, notably in relation to child mortality and also creating civil society space, which is increasingly important in today's world. We're actually looking at shrinking space for NGOs and activists on human rights issues. Because Ireland is a relatively young country, we have a written constitution, we have perhaps a history which has taught us the importance of human rights. This is one of the planks on which Irish foreign policy is based. So we have always tried to promote human rights at the international level. You might recall that one of our former presidents, our heads of state, Mary Robinson, who I think was also on your
she was on my
program
show.
at one point.
Yes.
Mary Robinson was I think the first UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she continues to be very active on human rights issues around the world. So we do promote human rights in every way we can, and it was therefore an honour to be elected to the Human Rights Council several years ago and to use that experience to press ahead with our human rights agenda.
Another area that receives a lot of publicity is the 16 United Nations peacekeeping missions that some of them are operating in some very dangerous areas of the world. What role has Ireland played as far as the peacekeeping missions? How do you view the whole peacekeeping concept?
Well, we have actually been involved in UN peacekeeping since the first day we arrived at the UN as a member in 1956. I think somebody has calculated that there hasn't been a single day since when we have not had peacekeepers somewhere on the globe. We've been in a whole variety of places, but in particular in the Middle East. We are now at present in the UN peacekeeping mission in South Lebanon, and we are also in UNDOF, which, as you know, covers the Golan Heights area. Now, both of those are sensitive and, to an extent, dangerous missions. But Irish soldiers, Irish troops and officers are well experienced in the challenges of UN peacekeeping. As I say, after decades of being involved, we've frequently provided senior officers for UN peacekeeping missions, and indeed the current head of UNIFIL in Lebanon is Irish. So I like to think that Ireland in this way is making its own contribution to international peace and security. In turn, the Irish personnel, the military personnel, learn from their UN experiences and are able to put that to good use at home. We have been fortunate in that we haven't been involved in major conflicts ourselves, and if you like, our personnel have been able to we've been able to make them available for UN service fairly often, and it is a matter of pride for us that we step up to the plate when the UN asks us if we can contribute to a particular mission. We put the UN as far as possible first. We give it top priority. So yes, Ireland is one of perhaps a handful of countries who have been closely involved in peacekeeping from the very beginning.
Now you've looked at the United Nations from the inside and from the outside. You have a very detailed knowledge of the institution, and we hear a lot about United Nations reform. There has been, really since Kofi Annan came in, then through Ban Ki-moon, and now the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres, talking about how to make the United Nations a more effective and a more efficient organization. Are there any suggestions out there floating around as to how to improve the United Nations? Of course, when you bring 193 governments together and you've got a board of directors like that, it can be a real challenge. But are there some ideas that we might think about to make it a more effective organization?
Well, there are a number of things, Bill. First of all, for many years now, efforts have been made to reform the Security Council, in particular the composition of the Security Council, in order to make it more representative of 21st century realities, geopolitical realities, and Ireland will be very supportive of that process. But it's a process which doesn't look as if it will conclude anytime soon, but nevertheless it has to happen, that at some stage we have to have revisions, a widening of the composition of the Security Council, which, as I say, will bring it into line with the world as we know it today, rather than the world as it was in 1945. A separate issue is how to ensure that the UN is best equipped to address the challenges posed by the very Sustainable Development Goals that we've just been talking about. It would be fair to say, I think, that the 2030 Agenda is now the prism through which much, if not most, of the UN's activity is viewed. That there is hardly an issue which we now consider at the UN which isn't in some way anticipated in the 2030 Agenda. So the UN as a whole is trying to see how it can refine and improve its own institutions so that we have a sharp focus on implementation of the SDGs. And again, Ireland is very supportive of that, well, partly because of the role we played in producing the SDGs to begin with, but partly also because we have a very strong development cooperation programme of our own, and we want to see the best possible results achieved both nationally and globally on behalf of the poorest people of the world. So we want to see the UN working as efficiently as possible to promote global development, and therefore we applaud what is happening at present under Secretary General Guterres and under the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed.
Mm-hmm. You've been at the United Nations for several years now, and you've met some of the great leaders of the world. You've been certainly involved in the thorny issues, really very, very earth-shaking issues. In the last minute or so that we have left, what would be your most memorable experience as you look back on your years at the United Nations as to what I'm sure there are many memorable ones, but are there one or two that really stand out?
I'd have to say, Bill, that the one I will treasure was the moment in which the Kenyan ambassador, my good friend Macharia Kamau, and I lifted the gavel to bring to a conclusion the negotiations of the 2030 Agenda. I will never forget the moment after 3 days of exhausting negotiations and indeed nights when we finally got the approval of the 193 member states. It was up to myself and my colleague to judge the moment at which we could declare the agenda agreed. It's always tricky in these negotiations, but we, I think, did judge the moment correctly, and there was a huge outpouring of applause and relief and congratulations all around. NGOs were also involved. It wasn't just the several hundred delegates, but it was a great, great moment because we all felt, I think, that the enormous effort put into this process had finally been crowned with a great success. And we're doing this for the young generation. We're doing this for the young people of today and perhaps the next generation as well. So that was really perhaps the greatest moment. Along with a similar moment a year later, on the same day as it happens, the 2nd of August, when I brought down the gavel relating to the Migration and Refugees Agreement. That was another remarkable moment.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the United Nations is the only international organization that brings together the 193 countries of the world to focus on these problems and to try to deal with them as best they can. And they do deal with many of these problems. But your involvement, Ireland's involvement at the United Nations, shows that a country does not have to be large like the United States, Russia, China, India, whatever. There's a role for everybody at the United Nations. Ireland, I think, has 68,000 square kilometers, 38,000 square miles, 4.2 million people in Ireland, but there is a role for everybody, and it's remarkable what you've been able to accomplish, and especially with the Sustainable Development Goals and these other issue areas that we've talked about. I wish we had more time to go into the others, but Your Excellency David Donoghue, Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.